They're the world's most infamous serial killers.
It was the largest numbers of deaths attributable to a single mass murder in American history.
Here it was, all-American boy killing all-American girls.
But what drove them to commit their horrific crimes?
The victims had been cut open and their organs had been removed.
Was it nature?
Her father was reportedly a sex offender.
He's the most deranged fellow I ever met.
Or nurture?
The father stood and broke the mother's fingers one by one in front of the children.
Richard Trenton Chase, a killer with a lust for blood who would become known as the Vampire of Sacramento.
He wants to explore the body. He wants to drink her blood.
A man who murdered and mutilated indiscriminately.
Most serial killers don't do random killings.
Created terror in a community.
Everybody was very upset in the neighborhood, talking about buying guns.
And pushed the cops to their limits.
I had it in my mind already that if the baby was there, I was going to kill Chase.
But was Richard Chase a born killer or a product of his environment? Richard Trenton Chase was born on May the 23rd, 1950, in Sacramento. In many respects, his childhood was ordinary.
It was considered to be the typically 1950 dysfunctional family, which means that there was a lot of arguing, there was some physical abuse, but not to the extent that it was out of the norm of the culture at that time. As children at that time were very frequently beaten, and it was just considered that's how you discipline your child. There doesn't seem to be any severe physical abuse. There doesn't seem to be any severe difficulties beyond the arguing between his parents and the typical discipline of the day.
However, one aspect of Chase's childhood offered a glimpse of things to come. The young boy had a taste for harming and killing cats.
The torturing of animals is probably something that most normal children go through. Why it becomes significant in relation to serial killers is that whilst most children develop a conscience through their relationship with animals, they realize that they're actually hurting the animal. And of course, if you are continuing to torture, mutilate animals, you really haven't learned to develop the conscience in the way that children normally develop their conscience as they grow older.
Richard Chase, nevertheless, went to school in that area and for a time at least was considered to be conventionally dressed and able to fit in to some degree, with the other students. In other words, he didn't act totally weird, just only in certain areas when he was very young.
At high school in the mid-1960s, Chase began experimenting with drugs, taking marijuana and LSD.
He began using extremely heavy doses of not only marijuana but other drugs. Can a drug precipitate someone to go over the edge? I mean, just out of the blue, can you become psychotic without having some underlying disease? The tendency is to say that if you don't have some type of a vulnerability or a sensitivity, the number of people who took LSD here in this country and everywhere in the world we would have had a number of serial murderers running around. So it seems that he had some underlying difficulties, but could it have precipitated the murders? Not in and of itself.
Alongside his spiraling drug use, the teenage Chase had developed a physical problem.
He discovered there was a difference in his life from his peers in that whilst he was attracted to women, he wasn't able to achieve erection.
He began to think that somehow, since the blood is supposed to go into the penis to make it hard, as we all know, that if he got blood from some external source as a kind of a supplement, that might do the trick.
By the time Chase was in his 20s, his behavior and beliefs were becoming increasingly bizarre.
He thought he was being poisoned. He thought he had bones growing out of the back of his head. He thought his stomach was upside down, his pulmonary artery had been stolen, and he was in great physical pain. It was all imagined, of course. He began to address ways to alleviate that pain. And what he did was he began to kill small animals and use their blood and body parts.
Chase was committed to the Beverly Manor Psychiatric Hospital, where his extreme behavior caused fellow patients to nickname him Dracula.
Richard Chase now is doing things with small animals and birds, you know, killing them, drinking their blood.
He needed extensive care. He was not receiving as much care as he should have gotten.
Despite the concerns of some staff, Chase was discharged into the care of his now separated parents. His disturbing behavior continued unabated, including killing a cat in front of his mother.
One time the mother came in and saw him ripping I guess a pit apart and rubbing the blood on his face, that type of thing. And she didn't report it.
But the killing of cats was just the beginning for Richard Trenton Chase.
I think one of the interesting developments in relation to Chase's journey to become a serial killer was what happened in August 1977 in Pyramid Lake, which is an Indian reservation.
On a routine patrol, officers from the Bureau of Indian Affairs had noticed a pickup truck stuck in the sand. Looking inside the vehicle, they made a shocking discovery.
In the pickup, there's lots of blood stains, some rifles, and gruesomely, there's a bucket. In the bucket was a liver.
And of course, at that point, they were wondering if there had been some kind of a homicide.
The officers scanned the area with field glasses.
They tried to discover who might be responsible for this dreadful scene of carnage.
Perched on a rock about half a mile away, they spotted an unclothed figure that immediately bolted in the opposite direction.
He's totally naked, blood smeared over his body, so they were just certain he'd killed somebody, so they arrested him.
The man identified himself as Richard Trenton Chase, age 27, of Sacramento, and he claimed the blood that covered his body and his vehicle was his own and had seeped out of him. While Chase was in custody, the liver and blood were tested. They'd come from a cow. Chase was released without charge. Then, at the end of 1977, after years of hunting animals, Chase graduated to more serious game. In a peaceful suburban neighborhood in the east area of Sacramento, 51-year-old Ambrose Griffin had suddenly dropped dead without warning. his wife's first thoughts were a heart attack. The truth was far more sinister. Lieutenant Ray Biondi was the chief of homicide for the city's sheriff's department and in charge of the case.
In December 1977, this was the Ambrose Griffin house. And it's a very, as you can see, a very quiet neighborhood, middle-class neighborhood. But Mr. Griffin was unloading groceries from the trunk of his car and walking towards the front door when a passing car went by and someone shot him from that car. Shot him in his own front yard.
There were no obvious suspects.
We did a background on Mr. Griffin and we couldn't find a reason that anybody would want to harm him.
And there was little in the way of clues. Frank Davidson was the CSI officer called to the scene.
Well, there wasn't much evidence to pick up at the crime scene. But the next day, a couple of shell casings were found down the street.
We assumed that it was just a thrill killing. Somebody wanted to shoot a person in their own front yard.
We thought there was some kid shooting the streetlights or something, you know. No one ever thought of anything like Richard Chase.
More shots from the murder weapon had been fired, seemingly indiscriminately, into other homes in the neighborhood.
It's unusual because most serial killers are hands-on people. They don't use weapons that frequently. They may, have one, but they don't use it for their killings. So this makes him somewhat unusual in the profile.
Richard Trenton Chase had taken his first human life, and the murder of Ambrose Griffin was merely the start of a spree that would shock the city to its core. In December 1977, serial killer Richard Trenton Chase committed his first known murder, shooting 51-year-old Ambrose Griffin as he unloaded his groceries in suburban Sacramento.
We assumed that it was just a thrill killing. Somebody wanted to shoot a person in their own front yard.
The seemingly random nature of the murder left detectives with few clues.
We thought there was some kid shooting the streetlights or something, you know. No one ever thought of anything like Richard Chase.
Come January 1978, Chase was again displaying puzzling behavior. Residents of Sacramento's east area were reporting a prowler entering backyards and homes. At one residence, the disheveled intruder was interrupted and chased from the scene. The house was a shambles. Chase had urinated into a drawer of baby's clothes and defecated on a child's bed.
This is the behavior of somebody who wants to utterly claim control over the particular scene, that particular house in which he has invaded. This is the behavior of a man who's showing his contempt for the people who live there. Ultimately, he's not thinking clearly, he's not thinking rationally.
On the 23rd of January 1978, Chase struck again. This time it was no simple drive-by shooting. Rookie detective Wayne Irie found himself drawn into the investigation.
I had been just recently promoted to detective and had been assigned to the Metro unit, which worked primarily misdemeanor crimes. So I had been a detective maybe 4 or 5 months, not very long. We got a call to respond to assist in a homicide on Tioga Way. We were advised then that the victim was found in the residence and that she had been, they believe, shot and had been opened up with a knife. You'd almost want to say butchered.